Hi, Dr. Megan Connell here. Really quickly, what you're about to see is a recording from Gamehole Con where I was interviewed by my friend Monica, and we were talking about horror games and the psychology of horror. Please understand that we're going to be talking about some topics that some people might find troubling, and so if that's not your cup of tea, please feel free to skip this talk. I also talk a little bit about perceptions of reality and reality testing in there. Please understand I'm making some very broad overview statements. Obviously, the research and everything around that is much more nuanced. I hope you enjoy this talk, and thank you.
So you don't have to press record just yet.
I did.
That's fine. Just leave it. You're going to be fun to moderate, by the way.
Oh,
it's gonna be great.
It's the end of the day. I'm punchy.
Oh, no. I have some punchy questions.
Yes, you do. It's okay.
So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
All right. Hello, everybody. I am Dr. Megan Connell. I am a board-certified clinical psychologist. I am also a therapeutic dungeon master, certified geek therapist, certified superhero therapist. I co-founded a media company called Geeks Like Us, and I am the host of a live play D&D show called Clinical Role, where it's all a bunch of psychologists and therapeutic game masters running a game of D&D. And then I also am the host of the Brain Noodles podcast, where some geeky psychology ladies talk about all the pressing issues such as organizers.
Awesome. And this evening I will be your host. My name is Monica Valentinelli, and I am an author and a narrative game designer. And this interview is really about Megan and tapping into her expertise. I will tell you why I wanted to do this, though. So my very first experiences in role-playing game were with horror games. And since then, it's been a hot minute since we've discovered more things about psychology, and also things have very much changed in game design. It has been a dream of mine to find a psychologist interested in gaming to be able to have the conversation that we're having tonight. I can't tell you enough how just awesome it is to be here right now, and we've got some great questions for you. We will leave some time for questions at the end. So that's my house rules. So I'm going to start with the biggin.
Yes.
Which is horror a mood or a genre in your perspective?
I think it's a bit of both. You know, it's the genre that is designed to create the feeling, create horrific experiences for you as a reader or player or viewer, right? It is to get that combination of fear, anxiety, and a little bit of disgust usually that is that pull away, right? And to arouse that fear. So it's a little of both.
And how does that change when you apply it from your professional lens as a psychologist? Does a psychologist define horror differently, like from a clinical definition?
As far as I know, there's no like clinical definition of horror, but essentially, like in psychology, we're all about behavior. We're all about the expressions. What is visible, measurable, and objective, right? And so, like, how can we measure that? And so when we're looking at horror from that standpoint, you know, we're looking at these different measures to understand what's happening physiologically. So you're looking probably for like dilation of the eyes, you know, accelerated heart rate, accelerated respiration rate, restricted blood flow to the hands, and those kinds of things that tell us what kind of a reaction somebody's having.
So from a game design perspective, it's really interesting because there are a lot of different genres in game design, but also in media as a whole. So I guess my question to you, since you're basing everything on a science, right?
Yeah.
You're thinking about the observable things. Does that mean that you can experience horror in any genre?
Oh, completely. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Like I think just like there can be romance in any genre, right? It's not. You know, horror can be anywhere, but it doesn't have to be the central focus. When we're talking about horror as a genre, the central focus is those horrific experiences.
Okay, awesome. So one of the interesting things that comes up a lot in game design is that most games have to answer two questions, which is the first thing is, what does the player do at the table individually? And then what does the group do collectively as a group? So when we're talking about horror, a lot of game designers will look to analogs in real life, and they will notice things like the bystander effect, for example. So does that exist from from your clinical view? when game designers are looking at analogs in the real world, does that even make sense from a clinical point of view? Like, how would you?
I think in a game, so one, if anybody out there is studying psychology and looking for a thesis idea, ding, 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 there you go. Because here's the thing, is when we are playing a game, there is an expectation that the players are going to act, right?
Okay.
So trigger warning for recent events in the news. Did everybody hear about what happened in Chicago on the train? Okay. And I know we have, can she hear? Okay. We have a child in the audience. A woman was, for over a half hour, a man was assaulting a woman, and eventually he raped her. And people witnessed this, they videoed it, but nobody did anything to stop it from happening, right? And there's this, what the bystander effect talks about is a delusion of responsibility. And so it's this idea of they can do it. Who's going to take charge? Who's the adult in the room? So if any of you have ever been trained in CPR and first aid, when you go up to help the person, one of the things you're taught to do is to make eye contact with somebody in the crowd and say, you go dial 911. Like, you designate a person to be responsible for a thing. When we're talking about gaming, essentially what's happened is we're taking a group of people who have all agreed to be that person who goes and calls 911. They're there to act. So when we do like a setup for a combat encounter, we can have our player characters in a town and something happens. And the expectation of the setting is that the players will act. It's not that they're going to just observe and go, wow, that sucks. Okay, moving on, right? Or at least we hope they don't do that. Because like, they're here to play a game. They're here to answer a call. And so in that way, we don't have that like internal struggle of like, should I act or shouldn't I act? We are playing heroes, theoretically, in our games.
So because this analog doesn't happen well between the real world and in the game design world, is there a possibility for a group horror situation, like either from a rules perspective or from a narrative perspective? Would the horror be felt as a group instead of just individually, or are we always talking about this social contract of responsibility?
Again, really interesting question, and like I think it's something that needs to be delved into. I think you can create group horror, right? I think you can create that horrific experience. You're just going to need to think a little bit more outside of it. Like,
okay.
So I'm thinking through like the players seeing, a setting of something terrible happening to characters they really care about unless they intervene. Right?
Okay.
Or like, that kind of trope thing of like you're transported into an alternate reality where you see what happens if you didn't do something, and like dealing with the ramifications of that. Also, like, there can be something really powerful in having to go and clean up after, right? Because like after a natural disaster, it's not like, for the most part, it's not that there were no survivors. There's people surviving in horrific conditions, right? And so like a survival game can be horror. It doesn't have to be a monster's coming out to get you. It can be you are thirsty and there is no clean water. How are you all? What are you all willing to do to go and try to find clean water? What's going to happen? And creating that kind of sense of panic and dread, right? Those are all those emotions that we want to pull into. So often we go for the cheap stuff, right? It's like, this is easy. It's like, oh, here's gore. Like and like we've all become like very desensitized to gore, and I think at least in America. And so like, what are other things that we can do? Like, how do we actually get people to think of something difficult? I'm going to date myself here. If anybody's familiar with the movie Alive, right? And that's a horror scenario, right? That you are trapped on a mountain with no hope of survival, and you have no food other than the dead bodies around you. Like, what do you do that? Like, that is horror. And so understanding like how to kind of dig into that, and then that does create that group dynamic and the debate, and like, are we going to push back? What boundaries are we going to push, and how are we going to push that? It can be really interesting.
So from one of the things that I'm hearing from you is that from a design perspective, as designers, we should really think about hard choices,
Yes.
even if they have a clean objective, because that's where the power of narrative is. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Yes, no, completely. Like, yeah, hard choices, like it's really powerful too because like, so I do therapeutic gaming and therapeutic dungeon mastering, and like one of the most powerful games I ran, we were talking about hard choices. That there were 3 choices laid out before the party, and none of them were good. They were all bad. And because it was a therapeutic group, we stopped and we processed, like, this is what life is kind of like a lot of times. It's not a thing of like, ooh, this wonderful job with all these perks and all my problems solved, and this terrible job with awful people. It's sort of like this job over here that has some good stuff, this job over here that has some good stuff, but they also both have some bad stuff. And so how do I pick that? And, like, you think about, like, the difficult choices that characters have to make in horror games and horror shows, right? It's all about that choice and the weight of that choice.
So when we talk a lot about the choices and some of the scenarios that players are facing, then are there design opportunities then for players to team up? And if so, how, from your perspective, would you balance that against the horror so that it doesn't break the mood?
Yeah. Well, so is there a difference between being alone and being together? Most definitely. And let's just do a quick exercise with this, all right? So everybody just take a quick breath and imagine yourself standing alone on a mountain. And you look out across the horizon and you see a dragon coming. And you know it sees you and it is coming for you. Now let's take another breath. Same scenario. Only this time, standing on that mountain with you is your best friend. Dragon's still coming. Dragon still sees you too. Which one was scarier, the first one or the second one? First one, right? Facing things alone is way scarier than facing things with help, right? And so from a mechanics perspective, how can we approach that? So that can be a thing of the DC is lowered when we have help, when we have allies, or like we can roll with advantage. Or maybe like if we're being hunted by a monster, if we're with somebody and they're trying to scare us, maybe the monster has disadvantage. Right, and so like you can do small little tweaks like that. And also sometimes just getting encouragement can be helpful. And so like I've been playing more and more with giving inspiration, like characters can give each other inspiration dice through good role play. Through saying like, hey, I know this is scary, but I think we've got this. We're here, we're together, I'm not leaving you, we're gonna do this. And it's like, okay, cool. You get a D4 inspiration now because you've been bolstered. So that can be something really helpful.
So from what I'm hearing from you, giving players more options to either help themselves or help each other does not diminish from the horror experience. Is that what I'm hearing?
No, I would say it enhances it, right?
Okay.
Because you want that sense of agency, but like and dread to come in, and so it's like we're fighting against this thing, and like fighting against the inevitable. Like a horror game I love to watch is the Dread game where you use the Jenga tower, because Jenga creates anxiety anyway. Right? So like it's just such a perfect thing, and like, but there's a mechanic in there where you can do the sacrifice, right? You can decide like I'm going to sacrifice my character to save everybody else, or I can make that choice to pull, and so like the stakes continually get higher as the tower gets higher, but then you can pull it, or you can push it over. And all of those things I think work really well, and like I think that those mechanics are excellent.
Awesome. So it's interesting that you're talking about it from this perspective, because there's, one of the things that comes up a lot in horror games is fear of the unknown.
Yes.
So, and that's almost a trope, right? Like if you don't know something, that creates almost the horror environment. So is it possible to experience horror with consent then? Like if the players know that there's going to be certain tentpoles coming, can you still create that horror experience?
Completely. Because Lauren Urban had the best quote on consent that I've ever heard for gaming. It's like, just because I know the roller coaster passed its safety inspection doesn't make the ride any less fun, right? And so like it's a thing of saying like, we're not going to be saying like, okay, so the monster's going to be utilizing, I don't know, you don't have to give super specifics when we're talking consent. It's more like, generally speaking, are you okay with creepy crawlies, or is that going to break your fun, right? Because like we are playing a horror game to have fun. Which of course sounds weird, right? But like it feeling strong emotions is fun. This is why people like to go watch horror movies. It's why we like to go watch thrillers. Like we love that sitting on the edge of your seat and like having that adrenaline rush. It feels really cool. There's some awesome science behind that. We have these neurons in our brains called mirror neurons. And when we're watching somebody do something, the mirror neurons in our brain are actually firing in a similar pathway to what we're watching. So like there's some truth to this of like, if you want to get good at a specific like sports skill, watch people do it over and over and over again. Those mirror neurons are firing in your brain, and they're teaching your other neurons how to fire and what sequence to go in. And so same thing is true in our games, right? When we are doing something that is scary, right, we are experiencing that fear. The mirror neurons, and if we're really immersed in the experience, our actual neurons are firing to that stuff. And so it is really fascinating. And so like we can know that like let's just think about it. Like movie trailers basically nowadays tell us the whole plot of the movie, right? But yet we still go, right? Because it's not about not knowing the plot. It's not, there's some ones where it's like you don't want to, there's a twist and you don't want it spoiled. But like, even if you know what the plot is, you still go because it's going to be fun, right? Like, how many people in here have read the book Dune? Right? Fair enough. Okay, are you not going to see the movie since you know the plot? Right? So same is true. Like, you can still experience fear. You can still experience horror, even if you kind of know what's coming.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you should say that, because narratives have definitely changed. Like the style of the narration has changed quite a bit over, just even the past 25 years. How, like if you were to go back in time and watch a movie from the 80s, it's completely different from what it's like now, because we're always looking at those stakes, right? How do I raise the stakes? And from a design perspective, that can be really challenging, because if the world is always on fire and always blowing up,
nobody cares.
Nobody cares.
Yeah.
So how would you, from everything that you just said in the mirror neurons and bringing the science to this to this interview, which is amazing. So how would you deal with that from that perspective? Like, because what you just described affects the pacing of how we design adventures. It affects like the pacing of how we design a campaign. Like, what are some things that, from a design perspective, you would
keep a heartbeat?
You would look at.
Keep a heartbeat.
Okay.
Right? So like think about the heartbeat. It goes up and then it goes back down and then it evens out for a moment before it goes again, right? And so narratively, that's what we want to have too. Lots of action, then some downtime to rest, to recover, a return to baseline before we go back into action. Because if we're up here all the time, everyone's going to burn out. If we're too long down here, everyone's going to get bored. And so like we want to have that balance of moving between them. Like, this isn't a horror example, but it's an emotional content example. Like in a clinical role, my players have let me like have them really lean into deep emotions. And so so it's an opposite heartbeat here. So we go down first. We go down deep into some really, really deep emotions. But then when they've had enough, they pull a random encounter to happen. And suddenly everybody's hair falls out and they all turn blue or something. And they have some levity. So they do this, we naturally do that. And then like, cause nothing happens, and then we go down again and we come back up. So in an action sequence, it's just flipped, right? We're at baseline, the anxiety goes up, then we recover and we come back. And like, you gotta remember too, that your players need hope. They need to have that little fragment that's gonna tell them like, things can get better. There's something worth saving in this world. You can do something good. Because if it feels completely hopeless, it's really hard to keep the buy-in. Now, I'm thinking about this. I have not played 10 Candles.
Okay.
So like, I'm wondering like how that kind of works with 10 Candles, where your character's gonna die. But I think like, and please, anybody who has played it, correct me, but like your character's actions can impact the rest of the world in a positive way, right? I'm seeing nods. Okay, yeah, right. And that's so important narratively, because it's like if you just are going to die for no reason, for nothing to happen, well, why do I care, right? And so like we want to have our players have a reason to care, and we want to keep that pacing up so that we don't burn them out.
Interesting. So it's really interesting that you bring this up, because there is a genre of game which is about fatalism. And I'm sure all of us have heard of the games that focus on fatalism, where there is no hope.
Yeah, yeah.
And this goes back into a trope that has been very prominent, especially in early games, but also in a lot of like media horror, which is the phrase, madness.
Yeah.
Like, okay, so what is it? First of all, like you are a clinical psychologist.
Yes.
Like, so what is it? And can you describe some of the tropes, and then maybe go into a little bit about how we can shift away from that without being disruptive?
Oh yeah, okay, so much to talk about here with all that. So first off, I really don't like sanity scores and talking about madness and stuff, because I am a psychologist, and like when we're talking about madness, really what we're talking about is folks who don't have the same understanding and perception of reality as the rest of us. And that can be really scary and terrifying, right?
Can I back you up there just for a second then? I think we need another definition before you get into this.
Yes.
So what is your clinical definition of reality?
Oh. You asked that one.
That wasn't on the cards.
Oh, no, it wasn't. That's a big, okay, welcome to my TED Talk.
But we have, you know, and part of the reason why I'm asking the question, also for the benefit of the audience, is that I personally feel, and this comes up a lot when we're doing design work, definitions of terms are crucial to the design experience. And sometimes different terms mean different things depending upon the game that you're playing. So from a clinical perspective, what does that mean, knowing that you're going to go into talking about madness?
All right. I'm going to try to be succinct with this, because this is a big old thing.
Do you want me to time you?
No, it's okay.
Okay, I just wanted to
I think I got this.
Okay.
So I hope I'm not going to blow anybody's minds too much, but everything you see right now is essentially a hallucination, because if you hold your hand out with your thumb in front of you, like that, you see your thumbnail? That's all you actually see. All that your eye can focus on at any given moment is about the size of your thumbnail. Our human brain is awesome at scanning the room around us and remembering what it sees and basically layering everything on top of each other to give us this full view of the room that we see. If you've ever watched any of the shows where they basically engage in something called change blindness, where somebody's talking with somebody, and as they're talking with them, their outfit changes or they change out the person completely, they're playing into that. Magicians use this stuff with misdirection and everything, because like, I'm going to use your phone for a second. We see the phone here, right? Now I still see it in my peripheral vision, but I'm not really seeing it. What's happening is my eyes are continually scanning the room, and every now and then I go back to here. So like in one of those moments, like if really quickly something changed on it, I wouldn't know it, and it would just be magic that happened. But really it's because your brain is continuously processing things. And so to that, your big question of like, what is reality? Reality is something that we all agree upon, right? So we call the sky blue. That is something that we have all agreed upon. People perceive colors differently, right? Like, I think most people are quite aware of that. Like, there's color blindness, there's color sensitivity, differences. And so what I see as blue, you might not see as blue. Mm-hmm. Oh, remember the whole debate about what color the dress was that was on the internet a couple of years ago, right? Well, let's talk about, like, that's all about perception, right? And how our perception is changed. Another kind of fun one that I think has a lot less anger around it is like, what color are tennis balls? Are they green or are they yellow? Yeah, it's a little bit about it. It's actually like a color that is so close to both, it can be either, right? It's just fascinating, right? And so and then what is truth? What actually happened, right? We're all going to leave this talk, and we're all going to have a different story about what was talked about, right? And there's going to be points that you all will agree on, like maybe that I had on something pinkish, like that might be remembered. And so like when we're talking about madness, essentially what we're talking about is that little child in the emperor's new clothes, because everybody was choosing to pretend that the emperor had clothes on, but that one child went against that and said they're naked, right? In that scenario, that child is mad because they're not agreeing upon the narrative of the rest of the community.
Okay, you just blew my mind. Anybody else? Anybody else's mind blown? Oh my gosh.
Sorry for that existential crisis. I'll give my cards out later. But yeah, and so like, the early terms for madness were when we just couldn't accept the things that were going on around us, and so we chose to see them differently. Or like, if you think of even the term gaslighting in the film that came from, right? It was somebody trying to say to somebody else, the way you perceive the world is not right. And so that becomes this thing of, we become mad. Now, let's also own to the fact that when the term madness was really used, there were also things going on like high levels of poisoning that were causing people to have bizarre, experiences and hallucinations, which is the perception of something that only one person can see and other people are not perceiving, right? Because again, this room is essentially a shared hallucination amongst all of us. And so like, it's that thing that's outside the norm. It's the unknown, again. So like that thing that is scary is the unknown.
Okay.
And if I can, I think I'm jumping ahead in the questions. So
that's okay.
I apologize if I am. But like, when we're thinking about in horror, like if you want that feel, right, it's maybe your characters are seeing the world differently than the community around them.
Oh, wow.
Right? And it's so like, they're walking down the street and they see this big, humongous Cthulhu-like monster and nobody's reacting to it. And they stop and they point and they're like, what the heck? What is that thing? And everyone's like, oh, that's just Jerry. It's fine. And it's like, what do you mean? It's like, it's been here forever. It's fine. And like that can be a really great way to start, creating that bizarre, scenario of like, we see the world differently. What does that mean? Like, are we the weird ones, or is the rest of the world weird?
So, so let's apply that to a specific example, because something that comes up a lot in our games is that the party as players, and this happens a lot even as single players in video games and whatnot, they go into an area that they're not familiar with. It's completely a different town or a city and whatnot. And they're hired to do a job to basically help this foreign town that they're tourists in. And they're not residents of the area. They haven't been around or anything like that. So how would what you just said apply from a design perspective? Like, how would you make just a simple, I'm coming into a strange city that I've never been in before, seem horror, to do the heartbeat and all of that, just a simple like entry into that city? Like, how would you manage that?
So remember, you got to start off flatline.
Okay.
Right. So you start off kind of like, okay, you're here. Maybe there's not a lot of people around, and like, I'm trying to think of a horrific element. Let's say the whole town is mostly undead, right? And so they interact with, one of the living people. And then they're just kind of thrown into something where all of a sudden they're surrounded by undead, and it's terrifying. And then somebody in the town rescues them, right? Now we're back down. And in our recovery, we start learning this is normal. What, you don't have swarms of undead where you are? Oh my gosh, okay. And now all of a sudden it's like, what's going on? Why are these people so accepting of this? And then you can start, keep that normalcy again, and then you go to the next, And so obviously write a little better than that. That was terrible. But like, you don't want to they enter into the town and right away it's horror, right? Like, you want to enter into the town and right away it's strange, right? It's like, one of my backgrounds is music, and so one of the things that's awesome is to be utilizing a scale but throwing in one or two notes that don't belong in that scale consistently. And so it's like comfortable, ooh, slightly uncomfortable. Okay, now we're back to comfortable, And then like you add a few more notes, you add a few until like it's all kind of just this dissonance that doesn't make, and you feel lost. But then like you have to have a few notes again to kind of bring you back. And so again, it's just kind of keeping that beat and keeping it going.
It's interesting because you're describing, you are definitely describing NPC characters or characters as basically they've accepted this reality because this is where they live and this is how they cope. And the idea that the players aren't automatically rushing in to rescue them, it changes the pace of the story.
Yeah.
Right, from just a horror perspective, because but it also changes the agency. It gives the NPCs a little bit more agency. So what would be, because there's a power dynamic at the table, right, especially with the game master and the players, how, from just a running the scenario perspective, how would you do that without risking the GM doubling down to be very stubborn about, this is how these people are and there's nothing you can do to overcome their reality, or eclipsing it so that the NPCs become the starshine basically of the game and the players don't have anything to do? Like, how would you do that from a DM management perspective?
I probably would like step aside from the DM role for a moment. And so like this has actually come up in my therapy games where like I'm trying to teach my players to look and then interact, right?
Okay.
And so talking about going into another culture, and saying like, okay, imagine that you just got off a plane in Japan and now you're trying to go around and ask for information, right? Like you don't know how that culture works. You don't understand it. Like you need to take some time and like, maybe you see it as being bad or being wrong, but like you're not going to change everybody's minds by yelling at them. And so like if we want to change this, how are we going to slowly bring about change? Unfortunately right now we live in times that are really illustrative of this point, right? Because like imagine us from 2017 seeing our lives right now. Isn't this a little bit of a horrific scenario? Like where we have thousands of people dying every day and nobody really seems to care anymore because it's been happening for 18, 19 months, right? That's terrifying. Like that's kind of horrific. And we're all just numb to it. We're used to it. It's like, yeah, this is what happens now. This is now this is, and so like, who's wrong to feel that? Like our past self who would be like, oh my God, why are you not like on fire about what's happening, versus our current self is like, this keeps happening, right? It's all in the perspective that you take. And so kind of understanding this, sorry, I'm making this way more complicated for you all to think about, I know. But like
that's also why we're here.
Yes. Because like it is really complicated, and to change people's minds and to like help them, because like, in that scenario where there's that Cthulhu monster, right? How do we, tell everybody that thing is bad and it's like giving them nightmare dreams and feeding off of their life energy at night in a way that they're going to understand because they've just existed with this thing their whole life. And that can be really, really challenging. And so I think as a DM, it is okay sometimes to say like, guys, like understand you're dealing with an ingrained belief here. Much in the same way as like you might be trying to convince somebody that like, I don't know, you can pick kind of any example in the real world. And like, and what that does is it helps players. So I'm going to dive more into psychology. I apologize, but you're seeing a psychologist. So
can we all agree that Megan is awesome and she doesn't need to apologize? Thank you.
So Gary Allen Fine did this amazing study that he published in 1983. Again, graduate study, if it needs to be redone nowadays. So like if you're looking for a thesis, awesome qualitative thesis right there. Redo his study. But he spent hundreds of hours observing people playing D&D and watching people play and interviewing them. And what he realized is when we play games, we exist in 3 frames of existence. So there's the existence of the shared reality that we all have, like that I am me, you are you, this is here, this is now. The second frame is the mechanics of the gaming system that you're utilizing in. And the third frame is the frame of the character and the world that they're in and their understanding of the world. If the lines between any of those start to get blurred, the whole game falls apart, right? Like So like frame 2, right? Who has played a game with a young child who changes the rules every 3 minutes? Right? It's not fun, right? And you don't know what you're doing, and it just, you want to stop, right? Or like the frame 1, frame 3, this is the one that gets us into trouble, where something happens to your character and you take it personally and you think the DM is out to get you or the other player's trying to get right, and that's frame confusion. And so what we're doing when we're taking that time as a DM to explain, like, this is what this culture of this town is like, is we're helping to solidify the difference between frame 1 and frame 3 and frame 2 as well, is that we're giving them that information in frame 3 of like, hey, you've just gone to Japan, where the custom is to bow, not to shake hands, right? You're not going to change that custom by just saying, no, we're supposed to shake hands, which we're not even supposed to do that anymore, so.
Lots of elbow bumps in
bumps,
our future.
Fist bumps, yeah.
Elbow bumps. So before we get to character death, which is something I do want to talk about, so what terms as game designers should we use?
So I'm going to go more scientific here. Talk about perception, right?
Okay.
And yeah, when we're talking especially around things like if you're trying to get to that madness thing, right? It's like your character fully believes that they are seeing big, tentacled monster in front of them, right? And they're fully committed to that. Don't use terms like you're becoming very schizophrenic, you're being very bipolar. Like, those are clinical terms associated with a diagnosis that creates stigma that makes people feel as though who they are is something to be feared, and that's not something we want to do. We want to, definitely that idea of losing your mind, losing your ability to engage in this shared reality is scary. And I think it's something that we can utilize really, really well without having to go to an insanity score, right?
So let's circle back for a minute. So there's a lot of anxiety at the table around, I invest a lot of time into my character and I don't want my character to die.
Yeah.
And you also talked about how we've become desensitized to violence, but also numb to it in our real life.
Yeah. So
let's flip the script for a second. Is there a place for grief in a game?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Please. Yes. 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 We love these characters and we grow very, very attached to them. And so, it's okay to be upset and hurt when they die, right? It's okay to feel that. And so, I've actually created a Game Master's dungeon journal, which is like a character planning thing. And there's room for house rules in there. And if you're playing a horror game, talk to your players about how they want to handle character death. It's like, how do we want to do this at the gaming table? Do we want to give it a cinematic send-off? Do we want, do you want to have your character have notes that they give to all their friends? What's going to feel appropriate for you at the table? How are each of you going to need to grieve if or when your character dies? And that's really powerful because, one, it primes that pump, right? It's like, okay, that can really the stakes of this game are that high. And two, it's like, okay, now I'm starting to emotionally prepare myself. So when we're, giving trigger warnings for difficult topics and things like that, when we're saying okay, your character could die. This is a dark, gritty reality world. This could happen. How are you going to prepare yourself for that? And how do you want your character to die, but how do you want your character to be remembered? How do you want to handle that? Is it a thing of after your character dies, you need to peace out of the game for the rest of the night, or do you want to keep listening? And then we just have a conversation when we respect those boundaries.
Yeah, it's interesting because I like to think of my own personal metaphor for death, whether it's a character death or when somebody dies, they leave a hole in the world.
Yeah.
And how big of a hole they left behind is basically touched upon by how many people they knew in life, who they were in their communities and whatnot. So when we think about character lives and death, part of the horror is severing the connections that they had, both in the horror scenario, but also after they die, because those connections is what part of made them who they were.
Yes.
Do you feel that way from a
Definitely, yeah. No, that's a really great way to think about it. I love that idea of it leaves a hole, it leaves a void, and trying to understand, and in my professional work, I would do work with some folks who were grieving, and We talk about the stages of grief, which do not go in sequential. The form of language we have is linear, so we have to present information. Yeah, we have to present information linear, but really, like, you jump around the stages of grief all the time, and you can be in acceptance and suddenly move back into rage. Like that is normal. Like, so if you're experiencing that, that's okay. You're normal. Okay, but like it's this interesting thing of like, someone can die. You've gone through your process. You feel like you're good. And then, like, maybe it's 2 years later and something happens and you're like, oh my God, I have to tell so-and-so. Oh, I can't, right? And then you're back in it, right? And it's okay, that's normal. And so, like, even kind of leaning into that in the game, too, and thinking about how does your character want to move through grief? Like, what does that look like? It can be really powerful.
Yeah, that's really neat. We've talked about, and I definitely want to open it up to questions, so I have one last interview question for you.
Yes.
So one of the things that often comes up as game designers is because in games, it's so social focused. We play a lot of times with people we know. We have different attitudes towards games when we play at conventions because we don't always know the people that we're playing with. But sometimes sometimes you hear like what you should be doing and things like that. One of the things that pops up every now and then is that games are a very powerful tool to face your personal traumas. And I wanted to know, because you use games in your therapy, but also the fact that this is becoming a vehicle for healing.
Yes.
But also a vehicle for narrative storytelling. Like, how do you feel about that as a clinical professional?
Unless you are a clinically trained person, so masters of social work, counselor, psychologist, etc., do not therapize your friends, okay? You can open cans of worms that you are not prepared for. You maybe know that your buddy went to war and saw some horrific things, and they clam up and won't talk about it anytime. So, like, thinking like, you know what? I'm going to throw some things in here, themes of war and horror from the war, to help my buddy face their stuff. You are going to bring up things for that person you have no idea. Like, you do not know what they went through. You do not know what it's going to take to put them back together. I do. And when people are coming to my gaming table to work on things like trauma, like social anxiety, like depression, bullying, history of being bullied, autism, they have made a conscious and acknowledged agreement. Essentially, we have consent. I have informed consent, where we talk about, like, what are the risks of therapy? What are the benefits of therapy? And they understand what they're getting into when they come. And unless you have that informed consent, like, even if your friend goes up to you and says, I really want to work on my trauma, can you please put it into the game? Go, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not your psychologist. No, we're not putting this in the game. Like, I'm not comfortable doing that for you. And maybe even if there's a little voice in your brain that's like, well, maybe you could. Go, no, I'm not a psychologist. Like, I'm not going to do that. So please don't do that to your friends, and don't open that can of worms, because there is so much stuff associated with trauma. There is so much difficulty around it, and things that we don't even know are things. And when people say, like, have a hard no on something, respect that. Like, if someone's like, I don't want anything that's like Pokemon in this game, right? You can ask, like, what's up with that, right? But they don't have to tell you, and respect that.
Psyduck.
Yeah.
Had to lighten the mood just a teeny bit for that. But so thank you for entertaining my questions.
Yes.
I mean, this has been a fantastic discussion. So now I'd like to, hands
already.
everywhere. Let's start with the gentleman in the back.
Okay, thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed hearing you speak about that. Role-playing games are improvisational, so anything can happen. And this kind of ties into what you said about Pokemon. So do you think that trigger warnings in some ways are antithetical to horror? And, gaming as a shared experience in a safe environment, I believe, like, to say a hard no, don't do it. But within this shared environment, to say there's numerous things that you cannot talk about, do you think that limits horror in gaming in some ways?
Okay, so I'm going to repeat the question to make sure everybody hears it. So, and to make sure I understood you. So we've been talking a lot about how we can extract horror. And the question is, because gaming has such an improvisational element to it, do trigger warnings and consent, correct? Does that limit the horror experience? Does that negate it in any way?
No. Firm no on that, because like here's the thing. Again, why are we at the gaming table? To have fun, right? If one of your players gets, so my line of trauma is really weird right now because I'm a former military psychologist. And so like, I'll be like, oh, I can use this example. I'm like, that might be too much for everybody. So the Pokemon thing, like that's an actual real example. Like a soldier I worked with, their buddy got killed. I'm not going to go into all the stuff that happened around it, but one of the only things they could find of this guy was his collection of Pokemon cards.
Oh my gosh.
Right? And so bringing up Pokemon is not a, ha, you hate Pokemon. It's, here's a reminder of your friend who died in a very brutal way that you got to witness. Right? Do you want to bring that up at a table where we're trying to have fun? Like, even if we're trying to create horror, that's not what we want. Like, we don't want to open up those cans of worms. And so, like, here's the thing, is like, if we know the boundaries are here, here, and here, anything else in here is fair game. We can go for it. We can do it. And that's awesome. And that is a lot of fun. And so, like, it takes away that anxiety, too, as a game master of, like, what if I bring up something that my players just aren't prepared to handle? And they freak out and they're like, because, like, most likely scenario of what's going to happen at one of your regular games is you bring up something that was a hard no for somebody. And they tell you it was fine and everything's good. But then they last minute cancel to the next game. And then they last minute cancel to the next. And then they just don't ghost you, right? They stop talking to you for years. That's probably the most likely scenario of what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting because as much as games are there to solve, like a lot of times you solve problems collectively, a lot of people are non-confrontational, especially when it comes to relationships. And to the point about improv, the other thing to think about from a design perspective is story beats. You know, every story, regardless of medium, has story beats.
Yeah.
And my suggestion is to lean into the story beats. Because when you shape things around the story beats, you can do it in a way that isn't railroading the story to still have fun, but you still have a basic direction of where you want to go. And I think the direction in a story really matters, especially in a horror game, because you are managing people's emotions more on a level than you are in other genres necessarily. Romance excluded, because romance is a whole nother.
That's a whole nother.
That's a whole nother thing.
Talk.
Sir.
I have a question more mechanically related. I did, wrote a lot of fantasy stuff. I wrote some horror stuff, adventure-wise, and I'm just wondering about the dramatic elements. In fantasy, I tended to have, conflict resolution, tension resolution, and it sort of followed that. But I find in horror, I tend to want to up that tension level, the average tension level. Do you think that's the best way to do it? Is there a more effective way? Because the other method is to give them that full baseline and then sort of pull the carpet out and say, oh, you're not really there, and really spike it. I mean, what's the most effective pacing, so to speak, for...
So just for clarification purposes, when you're talking about pacing, are you talking about one adventure or a campaign?
Yeah, one adventure.
One adventure.
Okay.
That's helpful. Thank you.
So thinking that through, like, what my go-to answer would be suspense. Right? Like, Heath Ledger's Joker did suspense perfectly, right? Like, he just walked onto the screen and you knew something was going to happen eventually, right? And you didn't know when. And, like, the longer nothing happened, right, the more anxiety you started to feel. And so, like, you can do this in rooms, like, where you can stretch out, like, something's going to happen. And, like, that's a great way to kind of build that tension without needing to, like, continually one-up the, like, challenging or whatever, and just to build that, like, almost like that claustrophobic feeling of, like, the room coming in around you, and, like, it's getting closer, that moment of something, and, like, it's like, come on, I just want it to happen because the tension is starting to get to me. And so does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
I would say another technique too with ratcheting the tension that way is to when you do have some of those tense moments, introduce a cat. because introduce something that's completely non-horrific, because the anxiety that people fear that something is coming and it's actually mundane makes that next time that something's coming that much worse, because they expected something to come, and it wasn't that you pulled the rug out of them, right? You still went into their, you still confirmed their suspicions that something did come, whether it's a cat or a dog or a chameleon, I don't know. But then if you change it the next time, it's going to be that much worse and more emotionally compelling for them. Mm-hmm. More hands.
So we were talking a little bit earlier about how a lot of times role-playing has such a big improvisational side to it. There's also, I imagine, if you play enough games, bound to be a time where you accidentally hit a nerve. Maybe it's you didn't know what was going to be. Maybe you didn't know this was a trigger for somebody. Maybe you didn't know that was a trauma, but you accidentally hurt somebody, or somebody is triggered really badly. What is the healthiest way to handle that situation, resolve that situation for your?
That's a great question.
That's a great question. So
yeah, that's absolutely. So the question is, if you were to accidentally cause harm, what is the healthiest way to handle that?
Sit down with your player and ask them if they're in a place to talk. Right. Also, probably preface to that, you want to use safety tools at your table. I feel like that doesn't, hopefully we just shouldn't need to say that anymore. Please do. Like X cards are great if you're playing online. Like I love because you can whisper them, and is great. Sit down and chat with the player. Own your side of it. Own like I didn't realize. I am so sorry. Like. Are you in a place where you can help me understand what's going on so I don't do something like this again, right? Or like if you forgot the person's arachnophobic and you introduced the gargantuan long legs and they're super angry at you, rightfully so, and just, you can own that. It's okay to be like, I'm sorry, I genuinely forgot. There's no excuse for that. Like I understand if you need to take a break from the game. I understand, what you need. Like, I hope you also understand I do feel badly, and I don't want to do that again.
So what you're talking about is the healthiest way of dealing with it is to own your mistake, but then let the decision about what happens next on the person that's hurt.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
You had a question. Did you want to ask it real quick?
It's actually the same question.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
Same question. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Time is wibbly wobbly. Okay. Have fun at your game.
I just had like a kind of add-on comment, something I found useful for players that like maybe they didn't even know that was going to be like a trigger point or something. Is like my intervention tool, like I call it intermission, because people are more likely to use it if they feel like they're not stopping the game for everyone else.
Oh,
like,
interesting.
Yeah. Oh, that's
like
great.
It feels like I'll pause and you're not ruining it for everyone else, and they're more likely to use it.
So the comment is to reframe the safety tools as intermission, so that the game feels like it continues, because there's that social. I'm guessing this comes from a place of social anxiety where you don't want to ruin people's fun because you're experiencing something uncomfortable. So thank you for that very much.
That's awesome.
Any other hands? In the back.
We were talking about the suspension and that whole bystander syndrome. But in the same vein, trigger warnings and giving them foresight of that, it does sort of undercut that suspension. But given how necessary trigger warnings are, is there a good way to get that tension, that suspense back?
Yeah, I think like it still can be there again, because like you can go to a horror movie and know that you're going to see somebody's guts get ripped out and still experience all the same emotions and stuff. It doesn't also have that secondary gut punch of you weren't emotionally prepared, right? Like for me with the military experience, like if there's stuff about like brains being exploded everywhere, I don't love that. Like I don't need a trigger warning for it, but if I get one, that's cool, right? Because I'm like, okay, that part of my brain that has to deal with that, holding those memories for other folks, I know to kind of set that over here and to engage with some of my coping mechanisms and just kind of have that stuff ready. So like you don't need to have the gotcha moments, because like again, we know the movie before we go to it because of the trailers, but we still go and we still experience everything.
So I do have a follow-up question about trigger warnings. So I have a question for you. So do you feel that, because you were talking about that social contract earlier and about how all players you want to have make choices, do you feel that trigger warnings, what they do is they actually help increase player agency?
Yes.
Because then they make the choices to engage.
Yep.
And are they going to be more willing to participate in the horror then?
I think completely, yes. Yes. Because like you know what's coming up and so you can prepare yourself. Now also like you can understand like when your line is, maybe you say like, oh, I think I can handle this. Then it comes up, it's like, no, I can't handle this. And that's where you need the safety tools in there because a player might go, not your bad because you gave a trigger warning, you asked me, and I still couldn't handle it. So that's on me as a player now, right? So that's the opposite side of this where we have to own our own stuff. But like it's like, I know what's coming so I can kind of prepare myself and I can engage more fully. And that, that can be really fun too.
And also, to your point about trigger warnings, technically, from a technical standpoint, you don't necessarily do trigger warnings before every scene, but you do them before the session or the campaign. Mm-hmm. And that changes the conversation because if it's over a longer period of time, there's a lot of chances to ratchet up the suspense. But if you were to do it in front of every scene, I could kind of see how that would.
Yeah, I wouldn't do it in front of every scene, but I would say, like, if you're getting ready to run a game and like it has a lot of body horror, like trigger warning, this game is full of body horror. If that is not your cup of tea, this is not going to be your game.
Other hands.
So session 0 is usually pretty important in general.
Yes.
I would think. Would you feel it's essential for a horror game?
So the question's about session 0. I have a whole big video on this on Geeks Like Us. Yes, I think session 0 is vital. And I think you need to revisit session 0 for long-term campaigns. Like every 10 to 20 sessions, it's a good idea to have a revisit of session 0. And you don't have to go full into session 0 again. It's just okay, we talked about the game being this way and these expectations. How are we doing? Are we hitting the mark? Are we missing the mark? Has the line changed for anybody? We all came in saying we want to play bad guys. How's that going for you all? Are you enjoying that? Are you finding it fun? Or was the concept of playing an evil character much more fun than the reality of playing an evil character? And so having these conversations all the time is really important. Because again, people are at the gaming table to have fun. And we want to make sure that they're having fun.
Absolutely.
Even if they're bawling their eyes out sometimes.
I want to take some more questions because we have Megan.
Yeah.
Rather him go first, but
okay, that's okay. Go ahead.
So I was gonna ask if you could elaborate on the 3 frames of real life mechanics and in-game.
Do you have a reference for that?
Find 1983 Shared Fantasy is the book that it comes from. Also, the training I developed with Dr. Boca Mazzaro, we talk a lot about that as well. The quick and dirty of it was that in the early 80s, during the start of the Satanic Panic, there was a lot of fear that playing role-playing games increased the risk that you were going to develop schizophrenia because you were going to stop understanding who you were going to get dissociative identity disorder, all that stuff. And what Fine found was that by playing, you actually increased your understanding of what was real, what was fantasy, and there's actually been one qualitative study with one person with schizophrenia, so very incredibly, the smallest sample group you could have, but where the person was playing D&D with their therapist who had schizophrenia, and it improved their reality testing.
That's awesome.
Yeah, because they were practicing being between these different frames and understanding what the player perceives is different from what the character perceives, and then the game mechanics tie it all together.
That's awesome.
That's sort of a specific on that. So I feel like a lot of times the mechanics are there to be the blurred line between our reality and the game reality. So and then metagaming is problematic because that's taking that bridge and using it in the wrong way. So I know that some DMs will, if they're playing a horror type campaign, they will sometimes just have dice rolls that don't mean anything.
Yeah.
But are kind of playing on the metagaming aspect of someone who's trying to use that framing correctly, and then uses that to increase
totally
for just the person, because it's not increasing any horror for the character. It's just the real life stress of the DM's doing something right now. So what is that an appropriate use of that sort of blurring lines? Because
Yeah, so the question is like rolling dice without really like meaning anything, just as a way to ratchet up anxiety in your players. Like, I think so. Is that, you know, like, and like, here's how I use that sometimes is like, if my players are taking too long to make a decision, I start rolling dice to get them to be like, oh, we need to hurry up and make a decision.
Oh,
now.
that's so
Something's
much
gonna
better than
happen.
what I do. I shoot them.
Do I need to report you for felonies?
Like, I just, the arrow goes right past their ear as they're taking too long. Okay, so I will take 2 more questions. I don't think there's anybody after us, and I want to make sure that, is there somebody
Okay.
after us?
Oh,
Okay,
we'll be
so,
super quick.
So we'll be super quick. We'll take 2 more questions, so.
Okay, I was simply going to ask, because this is part of that whole big friend mind thing. One of my favorite games is Eternal Darkness, and that plays a lot with fourth wall horror.
Okay.
I just wanted to know if you think that there may be a place for that in tabletop as well.
Ooh. Oh, that would be cool. So the question is breaking the having a fourth wall horror thing.
Yeah.
I think so, that would be cool. I'd want to see that. I don't know how it would work, but I would want to see that.
So this is, I do think there's a place to advance horror in general, just as I would say any genre. But I'm going to say 3 words. Playtest, playtest, playtest. Because you can come up with the things in your mind as much as you want, but you really need to have the experience of other people playing your game and having a playtest kit so somebody can run off with it, but also you running sometimes your own playtest, because without that feedback and that interactive, you're not going to be able to change, because it's just in your mind. And when it's in your mind, it's really hard to see how it plays out at the table a lot of times.
Yeah.
Very briefly, I was actually on the same thing. Mike Merles yesterday spoke about the success of 5th edition and the problems of 4th edition in the framework of the 3 frames and how that
Interesting.
didn't work well with it. So you might look up the music. I don't know if he's written anything or published in a blog or anything about it, but it was really interesting about how 4th edition, he felt maybe didn't do such a good job of translating between player and character mechanics, and expose mechanics to the character, which made you fall out of it, whereas you can expose mechanics to the player. And I thought it was just an interesting thing. Look up if you're interested in that. It was really good.
Absolutely, thank you. And with that, we are out of time, and I'm so sorry that I can't take any more questions, but thank you for coming here, being such a patient audience. And thanks, Megan, for your time and your expertise.
Thank you.